Right. That's so right. So in 1994, so I get trained as a good, empirical scientist, and I buy when I'm an undergraduate. I have this notion that it should make sense, but then it's like, oh, okay, and then I buy, oh, it's the scientific method, blah blah blah, and then I was under the impression that the scientific method had yielded the idea that certain approaches were better than others. So this is in the right in the late 1980s, where the cognitive and behavioral approaches were waving the flag that they were better than the other approaches, and that science had enabled them to make that justification. By the way, although I'm well-versed in all that, that's all bullshit, okay? I didn't realize it at the time, but I thought, so I was like, okay, I'm going to follow the science there. Then you get into the clinic room, and you also get knowledgeable about the way research is actually done and what was then unfolding at the time, which is called the dodo bird finding. It's actually all credible psychotherapies get the exact same basic, certainly in almost every generalized anxious, depressed cluster. It's amazing how common the dodo bird finding is. Anyway, so you get all this generalized effects, okay? And then you get the fact that when you sit with somebody, okay, sit with the psyche, okay? I didn't have the term at the time, but it was like you enter into the world with the psyche, and then you get this whole idiographic, there are general categories like depression, but it's really this idiographic dance with a unique particular, okay? And you're like, my humanistic side gets pulled in very strong. So it's like, oh my God, but I'm totally a scientist. So I'm like, why can't I have a coherent science? I look at medicine's all fucked up, but they at least have Western medicines like, hey, physiology, anatomy, we can anchor this to human biology, and we know what human biology is. It's living processes that give rise to physiology and anatomy. They break down. We can study physiology and anatomy. We divide the systems up, and everyone's works out okay. I was like, hey, you have a bone problem, you see a generalist, and then you go to an orthopedic specialist. And nobody says, oh, the orthopedic specialist, that's the key to health. And I was like, no, that's a part of the system. So what I'm like, all of these insights make sense, but they should be grounded in the science. And that's when I went from my empirical training, and then I was like, but that's not help. What I really need, like biology is the science of life, I need to know what psychology is. And then in 1994, 1995, when I did that, I realized I needed a big picture view, and I found evolutionary psychology, which was just coming on the scene at the time. The adapted mind is a sort of the Bible of evolutionary psychology. That came out in 1992. Robert Wright had written a book called The Moral Animal in 1994. And I fell into that. I was like, oh, I didn't really learn evolutionary theory. And I really studied and taught myself evolutionary theory. And I was like, of course, this provides a big picture view. And so for 2 years, I was thinking evolutionary psychology was key. And then I stumbled across this justification idea. And then that really blew up evolutionary psychology. Okay. So ironically, because it's a totally evolutionary psych idea, but it actually blows up evolutionary psychology, even as an evolutionary idea. And it shows how limited evolutionary psychology really is. And that's when I shifted away from there and then backed into the tree of knowledge system, which at the time was in the framework, and it grows into UTALK itself, the unified theory of knowledge. But anyway, yeah, that was, so I started in the clinic room, and ultimately I returned through the garden. I actually returned to the proper holding. We talk about psyche and science, to the proper holding of a unique idiographic lateral perspective versus a generalized nomethetic perspective. The key is an epistemology that produces an ontology that coheres between those two perspectives, and that's what I figured out how to do.
No, that makes sense. I mean, no matter how robust the approaches to therapy might be, behavioral, cognitive, psychodynamic, like you mentioned, there just seems like there will always be variability in the way that the clinician applies it. Like, what's important is not the tradition that the clinician subscribes to. What's important is just the ability of the clinician to have clarity, have skill, have relationship.
Always. Yeah, it's exactly that's what they find. You'll read Bruce Walpole, The Great Psychotherapy Debate, that affords a really empirical articulation of exactly your point. That is it's the skill of the practitioner to enter into the unique situation, read and participate in the unique situation well. Behaviorists are as inclined to be able to do that as others. And then you get massive within various effects of good therapists versus lousy therapists. So we get that everywhere. And you can say, oh yeah, there's good therapy and there's shitty therapy. and most people are average, not surprisingly. And there are a couple of master therapists. They go in with virtually anybody and work well with them. It's amazing. And there are about 10% are like shitty therapists. They take relatively healthy people and make them worse. So it's all within therapy, relational, participatory dynamics between the vast majority of it is a psychosocial relational dance process, not the technical language. I just did a podcast on this like 3 months ago. Not the technical language of the issue. It is the psychosocial relational dynamics that's accounting for almost all the variants. It's hard to put a figure on it, 95%, whatever, etc. But that's where the action.
Yeah, I mean, just pragmatically, that makes sense, right? I mean, you could be the most educated person in the world, but there's no way you can totally apply a theory in the clinic room, like it to the letter.
Totally. And now, actually, the more you do that, okay, we're actually pretty reactive, autonomous creatures. If we get the sense that we're being dropped into some algorithmic formula, that immediately activates us in particular kinds of ways. So the more refined and quasi-autistic you are, and especially, no offense, but in that regard, you're not going to read the participatory dynamics of the individual. 95%, there are some exceptions, who want to be seen as a unique individual and valued for their own uniqueness, are going to be then quite resistant to being placed in a preordained structure. And if you're really good at doing that, that's going to be potentially good reasons that would work against you actually in dancing with people. So yeah, there's a lot of consideration to be given there, and the school of thought approach, while it has some merit, if you can do better, it's
no. I mean, that's a really good point. Like anecdotally, I really find that to be true. Whenever just speaking with friends, general people who aren't psychologists or academics, whenever people get the feeling that someone's trying to apply a psychological frame to them, like it could be anything, it's trait theory, development, anything. Whenever people feel like they're being boxed in and it feels too inorganic, people get very defensive and find all kinds of ways to get out of it.
All good therapy begins with Rogers, okay, in my estimation. And Rogers did identify the core ingredients. You better have, I would call it foundational positive regard. He called it unconditional, but you better have foundational positive regard. You better have empathy, and you better want to be orient toward the organismic valuing process of the individual. Okay. And be very wary about any preordained judgment, because they'll react against it and it's going to disrupt the process anyway. So that is the beauty of humanistic approaches. And to me, if you're actually going to have, mandated therapy, there are a lot of other contexts that's weird, but in general, the first point you want to make is align with the psyche. Let the psyche's doing its organismic valuing process. And then if you're going to bring trait theory to bear or any of those types of things, you better have it aligned with the psyche. Or if you're going to be as the expert that's going to portray your knowledge of it, the person may submit to you and say, oh, this is so helpful.